So before we finish our service Musaf, let's spend a few minutes asking this simple question. What was the sin of these spies? Right? What did they do wrong that led to such a drastic decision as to leave the people of Israel in the desert for 40 years? Why does the Torah report God's anger as being so great? As I said before, he actually wanted to destroy the whole nation. Disown them is the actual word that the Torah uses. And as we saw, only Moses' intercession saves the people. So we have to look a little bit more closely at the story to understand what happened here. Why this sin was considered worse than the sin of the golden calf. The opening words of the spies' reports actually were very positive, right? This is what they said. Indeed, it's a land of milk and honey. Eretz avat chalav u'dvash. These are the words that are now synonymous with the land of Israel. We call it the land of milk and honey. The honey is the date tree, not the honey of the bee. The spies certainly saw the land was fertile. So Rabbi Shlomo Riskin pointed out, the spies did not utter any words against the land. Praise the land of Israel. They do say that people living in the land are aggressive, the cities are large, they're well fortified. And they also report seeing giants there. And we have hints about giants throughout the Torah, and we have the most classic is Goliath, right? This huge human being. Well, we were Semites, 4'10", 5 foot. They came from Europe, right? Came by the sea, settled. Okay, so they weren't 10 foot, but they were probably 6 foot, Scandinavians, right? So, yeah, they look like giants. And reports about large people living in Canaan throughout the entire Torah. Then they say something very strange. The spies say that it is a land that consumes its inhabitants. But right after that, they say, all the men we saw were huge, and we felt like grasshoppers. So the problem is this. If the land consumes inhabitants, why are the giants having such a good time and thriving on the land? And it's such a good land. They describe it, milk and honey. Then they say it consumes its inhabitants. That's a contradiction. It's not consuming its inhabitants. They're doing very well. Fortified cities, large people that defend them. What are they talking about? Who gets consumed by the land? Clearly not the Canaanites. They're doing fine. The ones consumed by the land are the grasshoppers. In other words, what the Israelite scouts are saying is that regular people, the people of Israel, will be consumed by the land. The spies were not insulting the promised land. It was a good land. But they were saying it's only good for the Canaanites. It won't be good for the people of Israel. We will be destroyed upon entering the land because we're the grasshoppers. So if their sin was not against the land, perhaps their sin was against God. But when we look carefully at what they said, we see that the spies never say God was wrong. They don't deny that this is the land promised to them. Eretz avat chalav u'dvash. In fact, that's exactly the words that God used. They reaffirmed God's promise to Moses way back in the burning bush, where God said, I will bring you to Eretz avat chalav u'dvash. They quote God. You fulfilled it. You brought us to this land. So if they're not rebelling against the land, or they're not rebelling against God, then against who is the rebellion? The clue is the actual words of the spies upon their return to Moses in the desert. There we saw the giants. We felt like grasshoppers. That's all we were in their eyes. Notice the sequence. We felt like grasshoppers, therefore, that's all we were in their eyes. How we felt about ourselves, they assume that's how they felt about us. How we see ourselves determines how others end up seeing us. If you're a grasshopper in someone else's eyes, obviously he'll crush you without a second thought. So once you think of yourself as a grasshopper, the rest of the world will second your opinion. They'll second the motion. The sin of the spies was not against the land, not against God. It was against the people of Israel. They didn't believe in the people of Israel. They didn't believe that Israel could enter the land. They had a very low opinion of the people they represented. Who were these spies? They weren't just Amcha. They weren't just some person who said, I volunteer. No. They weren't regular members of the community. They were the princes of the tribes of Israel, the leaders of the tribes of Israel, a people who had just vanquished the most powerful nation in the world, the Egyptians. But they were still thinking like slaves. They still saw themselves as a despised, lowly, victimized nation. How could they possibly believe in themselves if they still had that negative self-image? So that's where the sin of the scouts lies. Here they were, princes of the people of Israel, a people who had just stood at Mount Sinai and received the Torah, a people who had just seen the splitting of the Red Sea and the drowning of the troops of Pharaoh. But they still saw themselves as nothing but grasshoppers. The sin of the scouts is not in the terrible report they brought. It was in their vision of themselves and of their people. Their negative perception of themselves as grasshoppers was contagious. It was a self-fulfilling prophecy of doom. The entire community despaired because of them. It spread like a virus. Everyone now despaired. They gave up on their destiny as a nation because of them. Aren't there so many Jews today with that same negative self-image? There are Jews who are the first in line to criticize Israel, forgetting to point out the crimes of Hamas and Hezbollah against Israel, forgetting the struggle for Israel survival. Every day, every hour, the struggle goes on. There are Jewish groups that are totally focused on the civilian death toll of Gaza. They don't remember that the ratio of deaths of civilians to combatants is far lower than any other army in Western civilization in this century or the previous century. And that in spite of the fact that Hamas does everything it can to put its civilians in harm's way. There are Jews who are afraid to assert their Jewishness in the predominantly non-Jewish secular world. So where, with exceptions of course, are the prominent Jewish stars of Hollywood? Multimillionaires, hundreds of millions of dollars, power. Where are they in this moment of trauma and struggle for Israel? They're hiding. They're laying low. Some have been great. They've been out there talking, explaining, and defending, and not caring if they get the next movie or the next TV show. This is more important, and how much money do they actually need? But too many have been silent. In Hollywood, in the neighborhood of these wealthy TV and movie stars, their synagogue was attacked the other day. That was a synagogue where they blocked people from entering. Fighting broke out till the police, of course, in LA came late, but finally did something. Check to see if anybody's charged or anybody stands trial. Don't hold your breath. Where were they? I understand they don't go to synagogue. It's a synagogue that they don't go to. I get it. Not a problem. It's still their synagogue. But do they not want to demand that the synagogue they don't go to be a synagogue that anyone who wants to attend can without being threatened or physically blocked from entering? Are our streets and synagogues going to be turned into Ivy League campuses where Jews can't walk freely or safely, where police stand on the side and don't intervene? So many are embarrassed by the self-confidence of many modern observant Jews who assert their Jewishness publicly. They are afraid to stand up to the public schools, which introduce anti-Israel curriculum into the classrooms. I understand none of them would, nor do any of them have to send their kids to public schools. There isn't anyone in Hollywood who sends their kid to a public school. They just want to force poor people to send their kids there. But can't they at least assert themselves to demand non-biased curriculums and teachers? They have the power. They don't stand up. On college campuses where many Jewish students are worried about confronting the ever-increasing anti-Israel Arab presence on the campus, they are afraid of the dual loyalty criticism and sometimes even of physical harm. You hesitate if you see yourself as a grasshopper compared to others. Grasshoppers have to lay low, they have to hide. Otherwise they get stomped on. In Israel, you'll never meet an Israeli who sees himself as a grasshopper. They assert their right to the land, and they insist that the people they negotiate with recognize the legitimacy of the Jewish state and denounce all terrorism against Jews and all terrorism against Arabs. And they will not allow a brutal, inhuman enemy to continue to rule in Gaza, which is right on their border, in spite of what many in the world say and believe. The leaders of Soviet Jewry did not see themselves as grasshoppers. You ever meet Anatoly Sharansky? I did once. He's the size of a grasshopper. He was like Yitzhak Shamir, who was a powerful prime minister. I don't think Shamir was 5'1", maybe, in shoes. Anatoly Sharansky crushed the Soviet Union. He brought them down with his defiance. They stood up to the bear. 250,000 Jews demonstrated in Washington demanding congressional and executive action to free Soviet Jews. We went to Washington, we demanded it, and people saw us standing up for truth and for fellow Jews, and what did they do? They rallied to our cause. And now there are 1 million Russian Jews in Israel, building and defending our country and dying in this war. The sin of the spies was that they didn't believe in themselves, and this destroyed the self-confidence of the nation. That could happen to American Jewry if we don't develop the kind of belief in Israel, in our moral strength as a nation, and in our Jewish tradition, which we degrade when we see being too Jewish as a bad thing for our kids. There are many, many things our kids can become when they get into high schools, into college, and into the workplace. Being too Jewish should not be one of our fears, unless we somehow see Jewish life as inferior to the other things our kids could become. The spies had a beautiful land of Israel before them, and they knew it was beautiful, but they were unwilling to go in and take possession because they thought like grasshoppers. And they lost the promised land for their generation. Their children, who didn't see themselves as grasshoppers, entered that land and established the first Jewish Commonwealth. We live in a land of great opportunity, more than any other country in the world. We also have an independent and free Jewish state. We should be able to build a golden age of Jewishness, as great as it was during the Spanish period before the Inquisition. But we won't if we look ourselves as grasshoppers, as somehow our tradition is inferior to theirs, or our moral position is inferior to theirs, or that we're too weak. That's what happened to the generation of the spies, and they lost the promised land for their generation. They spent their lives wandering in a desert. let's not let that happen to this generation of American Jews or Israeli Jews. Let them see themselves as giants in terms of their moral position and in terms of their abilities to maintain the land, secure the land, and build a powerful, impressive Jewish community that will continue to contribute to the world in every place: medicine, science, technology, and morality. Shabbat Shalom.